I am going to speak to you about the need for a global Chapter 11 or a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. And this is obviously an area for experts. But I also believe that within the wider political spectrum, it is a debate that has to happen. And I want to congratulate Jim, I want to congratulate Tom, and I want to congratulate all of you who are here to undergo this debate over the next couple of days. A little over a decade ago, when the IMF proposed the SDRM, on behalf of Canada, I was a very active proponent, and I remain a strong supporter today. And this is simply because as the world struggles to come to grips with the increasing interdependence of nations, which you all know so well, the hope is that given the benefits of global economic integration, that the globalization will live up to its advanced billing. This, of course, is offset by the fear that globalization's contagion will do us all in. And in my opinion, the key to achieving that hope, to avoiding that fear, is to strengthen and, if necessary, create the multilateral institutions that will make globalization work for everyone. And it's in that context that I believe the SDRM is an idea whose time has come. Now, before elaborating further, I'd like to raise what I understand to be the two main objections to the concept. The first is moral hazard, that is to say the irresponsible use of the instrument by a sovereign to walk away from its debts, to repudiate its obligations. A decade ago, when we went through this, when the IMF first proposed the SDRM, this was the most frequent argument I heard against the concept. However, in my opinion, moral hazard is actually an argument in favor of a global Chapter 11, because in fact of life, there is nothing to prevent a sovereign that wants to walk out on its debts from walking out on its debts. Cote d'Ivoire did it a couple of weeks ago. Argentina and Russia are only two of the G20 nations to do it recently. As Rogoff and Reinhardt point out in their book, This Time is Different. The history of sovereign borrowing is in fact the history of sovereign debt restructuring. And thus, in my opinion, moral hazard is not a fact of life born of the SDRM. It is a fact of life born of economic and political reality. I also want to tell, I just got to tell you this. I bought Rogoff and Reinhardt's book, but it's too thick. I haven't read it. I want to thank Jim Haley for pointing that out. But in any event, the SDRM would not increase the threat, would not increase moral hazard, in my opinion. In fact, it would reduce the greater hazard, that of unilateral default. And it would do so by providing an independent mediator or arbiter whose imprimatur would be a conditioned precedent to the orderly restructuring which would be in everybody's benefit. In that context, of course, the question then is, who will be the arbiter? And that's critical. And my suggestion would be the IMF, provided we were able to handle the issue and provided maybe perhaps ring-fence the issue of its preferred creditor status. Now, I believe, in fact, that the role of the IMF is the key to a successful SDRM, because the IMF, that is to say, is the institution that could best wield the carrots and the sticks that are required. In this way, the IMF would provide an assurance to its creditors through an SDRM that a sovereign government, using a standstill that protects it against litigation, would do so in order to implement policies that would, on the one hand, grow the pie, policies that would increase potential payoffs to all of the creditors while preserving social stability. And I've got to say to you that in the course of our discussions over the next day and a half, the question of social stability seems to have been ignored. And I think that's wrong, and I think that it is not an issue that we can simply ignore. The fact is, however, that the role of the IMF, going back to the original point, is important both ex ante and ex post. Ex ante because the IMF's access limits, if enforced, means creditors will use greater due diligence before they will lend money to debtors, sovereign debtors, who may well be in a dicey situation. And ex post because an IMF prepared to lend in arrears would be an essential to a sovereign acting in good faith, a sovereign wanting to sustain output, a sovereign wanting to avoid new credit restrictions that would further cripple it, and by the way, would really provide its creditors with the opportunity not to see impaired as much as is occurring right now, obviously in Europe, their collective interest. The second objection to the SDRM arises out of two alternatives that in themselves, in my opinion, possess substantial merit. The first arises out of the potential for a voluntary restructuring. Now, while these have always been possible, their use by countries such as Ukraine, Pakistan, Jamaica, among others in recent years, have given this option much greater credibility. I'm talking here of genuine voluntary exchanges, not those such as were recently imposed in Europe on the banks holding Greek debt, which were about as voluntary as a lamb's trip to the slaughterhouse. But as well, by the way, let me just say something else, and I say this now not from somebody who has a background so much in government as I do, but somebody who spent a good portion of his time at the leading edge of a number of the derivatives and the swaps when I was a young man in the financial business in the 70s and the 80s. It's very hard for me not to believe that what has happened is the absolute expropriation, if not the theft, of those people who hold the credit default swaps on that instrument. And I think that that's something that ought to be talked about. I mean, I think that governments have a responsibility not only to act in a responsible but in a moral way, and I don't think that that has occurred here, and I'd be interested in some of the views of the people who are here. The second alternative, after the voluntary exchanges, is the use of collective action clauses. That's the ability of bondholders to force, the majority of bondholders to force a situation upon dissidents, an alternative, by the way, that Canada also led on some 10 years ago. The problem that both alternatives face, that's CACs and voluntary exchanges, despite their viability and their real attractiveness, is the reality posed by the persistent phenomenon of free ridership. For instance, who is going to vote for a haircut if other holders of the same dubious sovereign debt can get a better deal, especially if they're vulture investors? In short, voluntary exchanges, collective action clauses can work, but getting there, and that's the real problem, is a lot more difficult than meets the eye. And at a minimum, having an SDRM as a backup, I believe, could be the key to the eventual success of either alternative. Now, in the past, you take a look at the Paris Club or the London Club. Does the London Club still exist? Does it exist? Well, the London Club of ancient history, to the extent, when most issues of sovereign indebtedness occurred, it was between a small number of players who could be gathered together easily. Today, however, increasingly, sovereign debts are bonds held by many thousands of creditors with few common links. Now, under those circumstances, the chances of avoiding free ridership in a voluntary exchange or through collective action clauses at best means a lengthy negotiations as the parties struggle to work things through. Now, some will argue that the retroactive imposition of CAC, such as is permitted under Greek law, would resolve the issue of a lengthy negotiation. But the reality is that that is nothing more than a default under different guise, and it's all the more reason for an SDRM. The simple fact is that whether you're going to have a voluntary exchange or a CAC, unless it is done quickly, the time and the damage from the uncertainty that flows from a lengthy negotiation is now so great that clearly we need a more legitimate, more efficient, and a more decisive mechanism such as the SDRM as the principal vehicle for solution. Now, this is even truer when you consider that the party that suffers from uncertainty is not limited to the sovereign that created the mess in the first place, but it's with all those other countries in similar circumstances. Find the ugly face of Contagion driving up their interest rates, eventually cutting them off from debt markets as the herd panics. For instance, who can deny that the dramatic increases in bond yields borne by Portugal, Italy, and Spain over the last year were the direct result of Europe's inability to deal with Greece effectively and within a reasonable period of time? Another example of the omnipresent threat of contagion arguing in favor of an SDRM arises from Germany's early raising of the specter, that is to say PSI, or private sector involvement, which is a euphemism if I've ever heard one. 2 years ago, and maybe he'll forgive me for raising it, but Jack Borman and I got into a discussion on this very issue. I talked about, I thought we should be calling publicly for a haircut. And you remember you said to me, for God's sake, don't do that, because what you'll do is to spark the problem. Well, Chancellor Merkel didn't listen to you, and when she did it, the pressure increased megafold, not just on Greece, but on Southern Europe as well. I believe that the statement about the need for a haircut in this particular case would not have had the same effect, certainly not to the same extent, if Chapter 11 had been an arrow in Europe's quiver from the very beginning. Markets need the clarity with respect to the rules that a Chapter 11 can provide. The objective is not to predetermine outcomes. It's to reduce the uncertainty about how a restructuring process would work. The fact is that financial markets deal with certainty, no matter how tough it is, much better than they do with uncertainty, no matter how benign it is. The problem that the Eurozone faces is that they did not build the institutions required for a multitude of nations functioning with a common currency. In the particular, and now there are many instances of this, clearly the lender of last resort is the one that most people talk about, but there is one, too, in this particular case that we're talking about. In this instance, they relied on what? Well, they relied on the invisible hand to discipline their borrowers, sovereign borrowers, and that's well and good, but even Adam Smith recognized that sometimes the invisible hand needs a much more visible hand. As a global economy, I believe that we have been warned by Europe's thrashing about. As a world, we do not seek to build a fiscal union along the lines that Europe seeks today. But the global economy is now so interdependent, and the threat of contagion is now so great that the failure to recognize the needs for the kinds of institutions that will improve the functioning of globalization, the failure to do that is irresponsible. Now, many of these new institutions can be modeled on those that exist within our own countries. For instance, in the case of the SDRM, Chapter 11, I've already mentioned it, or the Companies Creditors Arrangement Act in Canada, which I don't suppose that most of you have heard of. Good for you. But what we are talking about in terms of our own countries is not new, except in scale. Since time immemorial, governments have wrestled with the very debate that we are wrestling with today. And most came to the conclusion that bankruptcy laws and their derivatives, which would be Chapter 11, are a necessary adjunct to a smoothly running economy. The United States bankruptcy law goes back to 1801. In the United Kingdom, the process was introduced in the 16th century. And for those of you who believe that this is a radical departure from the norm, they should know that some form of law pertaining to bankruptcy, albeit not very humane, dates back to ancient Babylon. So I ask you, if that's the case, why is it so difficult for us to grasp that in a global economy, which to all intents and purposes is seamless, that the same reasoning which works nationally must now be applied internationally? Is the program that the SDRM might infringe on a country's sovereignty? That was also an argument that I heard. Well, you just tell me this. How much sovereignty does Greece have left? The workers at General Motors. The workers at General Motors paid a penalty for their company's failure to act when Japanese competitors began to erode grievously their market share. After Chapter 11, however, many of those workers kept their jobs, and many of those workers have hope for the future. Well, the people in the streets in Greece are paying a price for their government's failure to act a decade ago. Do they not have the right to hope for the future? And would an SDRM 3 years ago, 5 years ago, had not given them a greater chance for that hope, as opposed to the spectacle that we have all listened and watched since Prime Minister Papandreou's fateful speech? And it's in this context that I believe that the failure to act when the IMF first proposed the concept of a Chapter 11 should be revisited. Who should do the revisiting? Well, in my opinion, first up to bat, again, should be the IMF. It possesses the institutional memory, and it will carry the prime responsibility as mediator or arbiter and financier in any event. At least I believe that it will and should. In addition to the IMF, given the unbreakable bond between worrisome European banks and worrisome European debt, the IMF should be supported in that initial analysis, I believe, by the Financial Stability Board. Indeed, for its own purpose, I think the Financial Stability Board must be involved. For when the banks have calculated their equity, as you all know, up until quite recently, sovereign debt was deemed virtually unimpeachable. Well, no longer. And in fact, I think this is another side problem somebody should start talking about. If banks have got to have secure capital, and there is and sovereign debt is no longer a secure capital, then I think we're going to have quite a substantial revision of the way in which we appear these things, and I think this is something that a meeting such as this should deal with. In any event, it's going to be very interesting to see the next generation of financial sector stress tests. The other player which should be involved is the G20, hopefully playing a much more supportive role than the G7 played a decade ago. While PSI may not be high on the menu for the next summit, a group of think tanks is meeting in Mexico in the not-too-distant future under the auspices of, in fact, Andres Rosenthal. And if today at this conference we have started the ball rolling, I would hope that others would be asked to join. Well, let me leave you with one last thought. I made an argument tonight, I hope, in favor of a course of action. I'm aware of the flaws in my argument. Clearly, how to ring fence, if necessary, the preferred creditor status of the IMF will have to be thought through, enforcing its access limits, given the fact that they are more breached than the exception is more the rule. It will, again, will not be easy. Comparing a company like General Motors, where its shareholders took the first hit, with a country that has stakeholders but no shareholders is arguable. But you will forgive me, I don't think it's all that arguable. However, debating points such as this and the far greater issues that you are going to be discussing that are set out on the agenda is why this conference is so important. Provided that our debates lead to a solution, to the roadmap that is required, for the context in which we meet could not be more demanding. Today, the mantra in Europe is primarily one of austerity, and the result is self-evident. The IMF forecasts a severe contraction on the continent, GDP falling sharply, in fact, in Italy, Spain and Portugal, stagnating in France, and even in Germany. Well, austerity without growth can cut your spending, but it will not cut your deficit. There are a number of people in this room who went through the 1995 budget, which has really now become quite famous for having eliminated Canada's deficit within a 4-year period. We did that at a time of reasonable economic growth. And we did it because we were worried that there was going to be a financial crisis of the kind that has hit, similar to the peso crisis which hit us in 1994, which drove our interest rates through the roof. The fact of the matter is, austerity without growth may cut your spending, but it will not cut your deficit. And growth will not occur if your economy lacks the flexibility to invest in the future, and if all it can do is service past indebtedness. And this is now painfully evident in the case of Greece, but it's also true in the case of Portugal. And it's going to be so in the future as other debt-ridden sovereigns face panicking markets seeking security of capital. And it's on this that I believe that the real case for the SDRM rests. I'm not arguing that the SDRM is the final answer, that its existence is going to lead to instant economic growth and everybody's going to live happily ever after. I am arguing, however, that digging a deep pit with no ladder to get out doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. That ladder will have many rungs. The SDRM is merely one of them, but it's an important rung because it's one of the first that you have to step on if you're going to find a solution to the kinds of problems we're now seeing in Southern Europe. When capital controls were in commonplace, the need for a Chapter 11 and SDRM did not exist because governments controlled the supply of capital. But when the liberalization of capital became the rule, it meant the global financial markets controlled the supply of capital. And that's the case today. And at that time, when that occurred, the need for global institutions born of the global market, should have been recognized. I repeat, most of us in this room, all of us in this room, believe in the free market. But we also believe in the institutions that we created at home to mitigate the hard edges of the market at home. Well, why then, as the free market takes over globally, would we resist the creation of the same kind of institutions internationally that are required to mitigate the market's hard edges internationally? To close, let me just say this. There is a vacuum that has to be filled. Just as a more robust Financial Stability Board replaced the FSF, just as the IMF of the European crisis has replaced the IMF of the Asian crisis, just as the G20 has succeeded the G8, I believe the time has come to revisit the SDRM. Thank you very much.